What's up, gentlemen? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. And as you can tell by the title of this video, we are going to be comparing Colombia to Mexico. Now, primarily, we're going to be looking at Medellin and Bogota versus Guadalajara and Mexico City, because obviously Mexico is a huge country, and same with Colombia to some extent. It has a ton of different things to offer. So in order to condense this analysis, I'm going to be focusing on those four main cities. But before we get into that, I want to thank one of my subscribers for donating to the channel. I'll probably throw their name somewhere up around here. And with all that said, we're going to be comparing cost of living, food, weather, safety, dating, as well as the language barrier. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, let's obviously start with cost of living. Now, there is a major gap between Bogota and Medellin and Guadalajara and Mexico City. Both of these places are going to be much more expensive. In fact, Mexico City and Guadalajara are going to be more similar to the prices in Eastern Europe. I have made a video about the Baltic states as well as Poland, and those cities are going to have about the same kind of cost of living as it will be in Mexico City, as well as Guadalajara. So it's definitely not for the extremely budget-conscious people. I also mentioned in those previous videos that the only places that really compare to Colombia as far as cost of living, specifically Bogota and Medellin, are going to be like Buenos Aires and Chisinau, Moldova, and depending on what happens with the war in Ukraine or your risk tolerance for having Russian missiles flying over your head, then the prices in Ukraine are probably pretty bottom of the barrel right now, and probably other places in Russia as well. But that is a different topic for a completely different video. So, for the most part, Colombia is going to have a better cost of living. Now, the quality of life, which I've mentioned in previous videos, is probably not going to be nearly the same in both of these places for various different factors, which we will touch on in both the safety and the weather sections, because there are some pros and cons to Colombia versus Mexico. Now, overall, I would say you can have a pretty decent quality of life in both of these places. But you'll definitely need more money in Mexico City and Guadalajara. And once again, I do have to touch on that just because Mexico City and Guadalajara are more expensive than Colombia does not mean that they are nearly as expensive as San Diego, where I am from, for example. So there is great value for your money. And then if you are interested in the tax situation, Mexico probably has a more favorable tax situation than Colombia. And both of these places have decent long-term options if you want to stay there. You get 180 days on arrival, usually, in Mexico. And then you can stay for, I believe, 90 days in Colombia. And then you can do things with different types of visas to stay in Colombia even longer than that. So they're both really accessible, and they're both really close to the United States. Now, with all that said, let's get into the safety. Now, obviously, most people know what is going on in Colombia right now. Not exactly the safest place to be, especially as a single male. I will also point out that there is a noticeable amount of anti-gringo sentiment in Colombia at this particular moment in time. Now, a lot of people have misconceptions about Mexico and the safety situation in Mexico as a whole. Now, in Guadalajara and Mexico City, for the most part, you are going to be extremely safe. Yes, petty crime happens, but it's mostly on the metro, at least in Mexico City. And people have been getting their phones snatched out of their hand in Guadalajara, specifically in Colonia Americana. Now, if you are in the higher echelon places in both Mexico City and Guadalajara. I'm talking Midtown Jalisco, Chapelita, Andares, and then in Mexico City, you're looking at Polanco, Roma, and some other places that escape my mind. And maybe I'll give you some hidden gems since I'm going to have to edit those places onto the screen here as well. For the most part, in those areas, you're going to be completely safe. Like, a vast majority of the crime happens between cartels. So unless you are doing something incredibly stupid, then nothing serious is really going to happen to you. I've also touched previously on how the cartels are somewhat incentivized to keep their cities safe. In fact, there was a story years ago about how some tourists got caught up in Cancun, and they got caught in like crossfire or something, and the cartel, the guy who did the deed to the tourists, and had like an apology note saying, sorry, we dealt with this guy because of that scenario. And that was kind of a long-winded answer, but anyone who's been to Mexico and Colombia will say, without a doubt, Mexico much safer than Colombia. But I wanted to clear up some misconceptions about Mexico because a lot of people are super concerned with the cartels for some reason. Now let's talk about the weather in these places. So there are some misconceptions about Colombia, specifically Medellin, in comparison to Mexico. So people think Medellin has like this perfect climate, when in fact, Medellin gets about 3 to 4 times as much rain per year as both Guadalajara and Mexico City. Guadalajara is also, on average, warmer all year round than Medellin, while Mexico City is about the same. Now, one major difference is that Medellin keeps that same temperature for pretty much most of the time, whereas the lows, I should say, in Guadalajara and Mexico City are going to be much lower than the lows in Medellin. So you're going to have like 55-degree nights, 50-degree nights, especially in Mexico City where it's extremely high in elevation. But the average year-round temperature in Guadalajara is warmer than Medellin, and it gets about a quarter of the rainfall. And then Guadalajara, and then Mexico City is about the same as Medellin with about a third of the average rainfall. Now, I didn't really throw Bogota into these comparisons for weather because most people know the weather in Bogota is not the best. But one other thing I have to add is that the drinking water in Mexico, probably not something you want to drink, whereas in Medellin, it is fairly high quality. I will also point out that specifically in Mexico City, there is quite a problem with pollution, and the air is much drier than it is in Medellin. So I don't really know how you can get a winner in this category because it depends on how you feel about rainfall or not. But in my opinion, I would take the weather in Guadalajara over anywhere else. Now next is food, and this is going to be a runaway win for Mexico, specifically Mexico City, in comparison to Bogota and Medellin. Now, Medellin doesn't even deserve a spot in this conversation, but I will say Bogota does have a pretty good international dining scene, pretty good restaurants in Bogota as well. But it pales in comparison to Mexico City, which has some of the best restaurants in Latin America, if not the entire world, some of the best street food in the entire world as well. And then Mexican cuisine is just overall vastly superior to Colombian cuisine. So we're not going to get too in depth on that topic. Now, what most of you have probably been waiting for, the dating in both of these, or all 4 of these places, I should say. Now, I want to preface this with the language barrier problem. the language barrier in Colombia going to be much higher than it is in Mexico City and Guadalajara. The levels of spoken English, especially in the places I recommend in Mexico City and Guadalajara, much higher than the levels of spoken English in Colombia in general. So if you don't speak Spanish, the language barrier going to be a major factor in your decision because it's not even going to be close. And some people are going to say, oh, you've got these influencers talking about how they're dating these Colombians. Well, a lot of those influencers or travel bros or whatever you want to call them are doing P4P. If that's something you're interested in, certainly that is an option and that is a way to get around the language barrier. But if you are interested in natural attraction or whatever the fuck people want to call it, then you are certainly not going to get access to the highest level of Colombian looking women. Now, both of these countries, not extremely fit. I'll get that out of the way right now. Both of these countries have some weight issues and obesity issues, but throwing all that aside, in general, people say Colombians are more attractive than Mexicans. And for the most part, especially the paisas, I would agree. The one caveat is that there is some small enclaves in Mexico, specifically in Guadalajara, and the surrounding Los Altos region, and I would even say in Sinaloa, but we're not going to get all into that. They have women that could definitely compete with the highest level of women in Colombia. And so per capita, it might not be the same, but there are definitely regions in Mexico that have women that can compete with Colombia. And I know that might be a controversial thing to say for some of you, but that's the simple fact. Now, you may disagree, and that's fine, but I would challenge you to go to those places that I shared with you. Guadalajara, Los Altos, places in Sinaloa, Monterrey, and tell me that I am wrong. The dating scene in both of these places are pretty accessible for most people, as the women are open to dating foreigners. Now, the caveat is the things that you hear about Colombia are kind of hard to decipher because you don't know who's doing P4P and who's actually getting that natural attraction. All right, so that's going to wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching. This is another kind of long video, so hopefully you got a lot of great value out of this. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff to help me with the algorithm, and I will see you guys in the next video. And as always, peace, much love.